Look, I've talked to you before many times about the GOP, and GOP specifically senators, and you can tell what their real role is. It's controlled opposition. They're there to pretend to oppose all this communist filth, but right when it comes down to actually draining the swamp or stopping something, that's when they step in and stop you from stopping it. They do it all the time. For instance, the DOGE cuts. All that DOGE stuff gets all kinds of flashy headlines. Hey, $50 million for tranny frogs in Zimbabwe, and you're mad and I'm mad, but they actually tried to get those cuts through. Actual official cuts, you see. 26 senators, Republican senators said, nah, keep funding it all. 26 of them. Let you know what they really stand for. Joining me now is someone who understands quite a bit about how deep the swamp is. You know him already. His name is Mike Benz, Executive Director of Foundation for Freedom Online. Hey, Mike, why in the world would 26 Republican senators want to keep funding tranny frogs in some random country?
They're donors, they're political lifelines. This has been the real pillar of the Republican Party since the early 20th century, has been the Chamber of Commerce companies, the international multinational companies that are technically domiciled here, but depend on the battering ram of the Pentagon, the State Department, and the Central Intelligence Agency in order to preserve their markets, in order to preserve their supply chains, in order to expand their profit margins. And so this is why you had this big USAID lobbying arm called the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, which came together in the early 1990s at the end of the Cold War, when the Cold War was over. So the American people were saying, hey, there's no need for NATO anymore. There's no need for USAID, or at least as large a function. There's no need for all these State Department grants because the Cold War is over. We're supposed to be having a peace dividend. And it was right at that time that something called the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition formed, which is today sort of the largest lobbying arm for USAID on the U.S. Congress, and they work with both sides of the political aisle. They're partnered with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and what you see here are Republicans who are beholden to multinational corporations rather than to the nation here, the United States of America.
Mike, can you lay out exactly what kind, and I'm talking about amounts of donations we're talking about, and I say it this way, let me preface it with this. It takes a ton of money to run for United States Senate. John Cornyn, that loser, he's going to run for Senate again next year in Texas. It's going to be $30-40 million. I realize that's a lot of money, so it must cost a lot of money to buy a United States senator, right?
Well, they're pretty cheap, actually. There's some great quotes. I can't remember how I don't want to misquote them, but there's some great quotes about how cheap it is to buy Congress. But the fact is there is a huge lobbying pot. Everyone knows when they see, for example, military contractors or big energy companies or big pharma companies who come in and buy, for example, the media, sponsored by Pfizer. We saw constantly during media hits on Fox News or MSNBC. We see all these corporate interests are the same groups that go in and provide the big lobbying base for Congress as well. For example, even folks like George Soros, who was the largest single donor to the Democrats. George Soros runs massive hedge funds and private equity funds, like famously the Quantum Fund, where he really got his start. And these invest in portfolio companies. For example, George Soros invested in Halliburton, Dick Cheney's company, for oil and gas refining. And what you see is, there is this giant pot. The maximum individual contribution is only a couple $1,000s from an individual. But if you have multinational corporations, they can put millions of dollars into a super PAC, and that money is thousands of times an order of magnitude of what an individual can do in their individual capacity. And so this is effectively what we see here. We saw these multinational corporations clamor for more U.S. aid funding because U.S. aid opens their markets for them. It's like a subsidy. It's like a subsidized business. When we pay for transgender dance festivals in Bangladesh in order to overthrow a government who is placing caps on the amount of petroleum that they're sharing with the U.S. or preventing the installation of a U.S. military base there, because that country is cracking down on the transgender population. Well, that ends up manifesting as a back channel conversation between the petroleum and the military companies with the Biden administration. The Biden administration then tasked groups like IRI and the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID to then work with the transgender population there, fund transgender dance festivals. That's why you'll see this in usaspending.gov in the grant list, and then work with them to mobilize street protests, to do demonstrations, to create human rights violations predicates in order to oust that government. That's exactly what we saw happen, for example, in that country with the documents that I published that originally came from the Gray Zone in just the waning months of the Biden administration. But this is so you can understand, this is to profit these multinational corporations who represent the donor drafter overclass of the guts of our government.
It's so ugly. So a lot of this, what you're saying is a lot of this international LGBTQ activism garbage that is funded by USAID is actually about something else. It's about money. It's about U.S. influence. And we're funding these things to destabilize governments who have angered us.
Yeah, they don't give a flying fig about LGBT. I mean, there are some true believers, but they don't really represent the senior class of the U.S. State Department or the U.S. intelligence community or the U.S. Pentagon. It's very cynical and self-serving. They will immediately subsidize and pay for the most extreme anti-LGBT groups in the world when it suits their purpose. They will fund, for example, the Taliban. They will fund ISIS. They will fund Al-Qaeda. They will fund, I mean, this is what we saw, literally the U.S. Institute of Peace doing this. And we saw $122 million or something to that effect from USAID funding these groups who are not exactly LGBTQ's best friend. What you see, and same thing with Nazism, they talk all this stuff about fascism and Nazism being the threats, and then they'll turn around and fund the Azov battalion if it's geopolitically useful against the Russians and to seize control over the energy market in Eurasia.
Golly. I want to talk about the Ed Martin thing because I was hot on this. I know you were hot on this. What was it about Ed Martin? I mean, it's U.S. attorney. It's a big deal, but it's just one area. What was it about Ed Martin that was a bridge so far that GOP senators like Tom Tillis would actually risk the wrath of Donald Trump to stop him? Why?
Well, D.C. happens to be the home court jurisdiction of the swamp. The fact is the D.C., the D.C. district courts are where all of the Trump-related litigation, as in terms of his government policies, are litigated. This is why the Chief Justice Boasberg has become such a villainous figure to the MAGA policy implementation, is because the D.C. courts are where D.C. executive orders and D.C. activity is litigated. So if you are going to, for example, take on Trump's executive order about opening the border wall, well, that's not going to be litigated in Arizona and Texas. That's going to be litigated in D.C. And the fact is therefore, who is on the other side presenting to the judge in these is extremely critical for implementing Trump's agenda. You need someone who is going to represent to those justices a full and zealous case for the government's position. And Ed Martin was a fighter through and through. One of the things, Ed Martin talked about the Transition Integrity Project just on Tucker Carlson this week, and was hot on the entire Georgetown law nexus and the domestic color revolution plotting that was being done by Rosa Brooks and the whole cabal out of Georgetown with Mary McCord. The fact is these networks are a check on Trumpism. And I think Tom Tillis jumped on the grenade. But the fact is as you put on that list of 26 other folks in the U.S. Congress, I think that there were several other senators who were having back channel conversations with Tom Tillis so that he would jump on the grenade and they would be relatively clean. John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, could have removed and replaced Tom Tillis from the committee in order to get a floor vote if he had wanted to. But he did not want to do that. Same thing we saw with others. John Cornyn initially, I believe, was resistant to saying that he would support Ed Martin. And then once it became clear that Tom Tillis was going to jump on the grenade and block it out of the committee, John Cornyn said, if it comes to the floor, I'll vote on it. But you never saw John Cornyn actually speak out against Tom Tillis's vote or put pressure in order to change that vote. So I think you have essentially this internationalist blob class of Republicans who who essentially jumped on, allowed Tom Tillis to be the fall guy for this, but they all wanted that as well. They did not want someone who was going to go after corruption at USAID. They did not want someone who was going to go after the bipartisan corrupt elements of the swamp. Because again, even something like the Transition Integrity Project, that domestic color revolution coup simulator, where they literally simulated invoking a breakdown on January 6th and then having Black Lives Matter serve as paramilitary street muscle, as if we were funding some Kosovar paramilitary group in order to fight the Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia in the 1990s. These were the analogies that they were giving, that we would effectively fund Antifa and Black Lives Matter. Right after the George Floyd riots had just happened, they were still playing out when they were doing these simulations. And this all serves as a check on Trumpism, which is what these international Republicans want. They want to get back in the Nikki Haley box. They want to get back on the George H.W. Bush, the George Bush, the John McCain, Mitt Romney, Nikki Haley box. They want to go back to Coke and Pepsi in terms of your only choices as a U.S. voter. And all of these aspects of bipartisan approved corruption that Trump is trying to clean up, they don't want that cleaned. And so they want someone in there who is not as aggressive, who is not as tuned in. And so they got rid of Ed Martin.
Mike, well, I could go on and on and on with you about this, but I want to make sure we talk about this angle of it. I do the best I can not to make myself sound like a complete quack. But when I look at the two assassination attempts of Donald Trump and I look at the circumstances around it, particularly the quick destruction of evidence on the first assassination attempt, from spraying off the roof to cremating the body right away, Mike, I'll just come right out and say it. I believe elements inside of the United States government were involved in the attempted assassination of the Republican nominee for President of the United States of America. You're welcome to hang up right away if you think I'm a nutball, but does that sound crazy to you?
It doesn't sound crazy to me. I think that is a very considerable probability. The fact is all it would take is advanced knowledge and allowing it to happen. It would not take necessarily recruiting people to do it. If they simply had advanced knowledge from informants or from surveillance that these attacks are going to play out, all it would take would be somebody inside the Biden DHS or Biden FBI or Biden Justice Department or Biden CIA to say, we've been tipped off about this. Let's sit on this one. And then simply have a few back channel conversations, keep it tight hold. But the fact is as I think that we've talked about, both of these shooters ran right through aspects of federal law enforcement and Biden admin intelligence worlds. On the law enforcement side, it was reported by, I believe, the New York Post that Matthew Thomas Crooks was training at the very same gun range as DHS HSI, who was actively recruiting and infiltrating Trump movement groups during January 6th. There's the famous case of Jeremy Brown from the Oath Keepers. Two DHS HSI agents arrived at his home about a month before January 6th and actively recruited him, threatened him that if he did not, as a Green Beret, join up with HSI and become an informant, that he could have problems, but those problems would go away and he might be able to make some money from it if he became an informant. HSI, we later learned from Congress, or at least was testimony was published in a congressional letter on this that HSI agents reportedly replaced almost half of the Secret Service agents in at the Butler rally. We're told because Secret Service had a diminished force because they were split between the NATO summit and a Jill Biden trip. So HSI is training at the Matthew Thomas Crooks gun range. All it would have taken is for them to see this Matthew Thomas Crooks guy putting a Trump face, for example, on a Trump bullet, or talking to guys at the gun range, and then you've got an HSI connection there. HSI would have been in position to allow the shot to go through, to the extent that they replaced Secret Service agents that day. So this whole thing could have been in-house with 4 or 5 people simply allowing it to happen. On the Ryan Routh case, it's even crazier. Ryan Routh was a part of a 501c3 Ukraine nonprofit network, the exact nonprofit network that is such a big part of the USAID presence in Ukraine. It was called the Volunteer Center of Ukraine, that he gave his card to Customs and Border Patrol in 2023 that he was the director of. They've denied that, but it was on his business card that he handed to Customs and Border Patrol. Customs and Border Patrol then referred an investigation on Ryan Routh in 2023 to DHS HSI. And according to Customs and Border Patrol, DHS HSI, quote, refused to investigate, not declined, refused to investigate Ryan Routh. Now, Ryan Routh at the time was recruiting at least 5,000 by his own numbers, of terrorist and extremist militia fighters from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, and Iran. Now, all 4 of those are highly CIA-inflected geopolitical conflict zones with intense U.S. military and intelligence pressure and infiltration of various militant networks there. And he was trawling WhatsApp and Telegram to get the front and back of over 5,000 passports of jihadi fighters in order to back-channel with the U.S. Embassy in Kiev the ability to provide an increased military support for the U.S. Pentagon in Ukraine, so that these fighters, who the CIA was backing when they were called the Mujahideen in the 1970s and 80s, now they're Al-Qaeda and ISIS, so that they, just as they fought the Russians during the Cold War, they would come back and fight the Russians in Ukraine, just as they were bombing the Russians, we're told, when ISIS claimed responsibility for the attack inside of Russia just last year that killed 135 people at a St. Petersburg theater. So the fact is this is a CIA network. This is a Pentagon network. This was flagged to DHS, and they did nothing. And this guy is a part of a sort of USAID adjacent 501c3 in Ukraine. I mean, it's like every single object on the pinball machine of the U.S. intelligence state. This guy just went bing, 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 bing through the whole thing for years, and then he ends up being the guy who's parked behind a bush at the Trump golf course to take a clean shot on the U.S. president.
Good golly. Mike, I have to ask you before I let you go. I know it's a lot. It's a tight knot to untie, and it's going to take time. I get that. Do you think we're going to be able to untie at least a chunk of this during Trump's 4 years with guys like Ed Martin now in place? Do you think we have a chance at getting some of this not just exposed, but accounted for?
Some of it. And a lot of it is personnel as policy. The fact that, for example, Pam Bondi has fired 15 of the J6 prosecutors. The fact that we have fired something like 14,000 folks at USAID. The fact that these funding grants are going to force a diminished capacity at the institutional level of many aspects of the blob if they go through. That's going to be the question. This is why during the period between inauguration and between election and inauguration, I kept stressing this concept of the Senate snaking, which was my belief that the Senate would end up snaking the president, and that much of White House strategy has to be geared towards coalition building within those internationalist sides of the Republican blob, because as I saw it, the biggest threat was the Republican side of the aisle, not the Democrat one. You have the votes with a Republican-held House and Senate. The issue is the Bush era, McCain era, Nikki Haley adjacent side of the GOP. But that is going to be something that will be continually negotiated. There's much more leverage now than there was during the Paul Ryan speakership when there were almost no Trump allies in Congress. Now I would say somewhere between 50 and 70% of the Republican Congress is more or less fully behind Trump. But the fact is 25 to 30% of the Republicans is enough to form a coalition with the Democrats in order to get their way on the budget, to get their way on funding cuts. But there's a lot of tools in the toolkit, and I think that this admin is serious about deploying as many as is necessary.
I said that was the last question, but I lied, Mike. I just have to ask really quickly. Do you believe there are Republicans, because I definitely believe this, that are just flat out blackmailed? I'm talking Netflix special, blackmailed. Someone has something on them. Look, when I hear Ken Buck, who's retiring from Congress, he's retired now, when I hear him, who's about to retire, lovingly practically make out with Christopher Wray during a hearing where Christopher Wray is supposed to be held accountable. Honestly, I've listened to that clip 1,000 times, Mike. I hear somebody who has a file on them.
It's possible. I think that you can explain the exact same set of facts, though, in a, I don't want to say more benign, because in a way it's even more insidious, which is the simple economics of Congress. You don't make a lot of money in Congress. I'm actually not against significantly raising the pay of Congress, because I think the relatively low pay, you have all of this power and you're around people with so much money, and you see yourself, and you can't even afford private school for your kids while you are making these, you're hobnobbing constantly all day with everyone who can. Everyone else is a relatively secure financial life. And here you are putting everything on the line if you're a bold member of Congress or you want to do serious reform. And you know that the moment you leave, you're already not making a particularly high salary given your influence and given the pressure on you. But then on top of that, when you get out, what are you going to do for a job when you have invested all of this in your career, and you've got no, significant financial prospects unless you convert that into something with the donor class. The fact is I actually think that the relatively low salary of Congress makes it so that it doesn't even require blackmail. It simply requires financial incentives. You are incentivized to do what Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and Pfizer and name your company, if it's in the censorship space, what Google and Microsoft or Meta want you to do, what the telecom companies want you to do. You become, as Joe Biden put it himself when he was running for Senate at 29 years old, he called himself a prostitute, that he had to prostitute himself out to the credit card companies in Delaware. He had to prostitute himself out as the poorest person in Congress. And I think that you see this, and so simply being economically beholden to your donors is sufficient to get you to be pliant as a doormat, especially when these things are morally justified by your allies in the media, and so it doesn't weigh on your conscience as heavily. But the fact is I think those money networks have a sufficient explanatory power, but I would not be surprised if there were elements of blackmail and coercion as well.
Mike, as always, you're the best, brother. Come back soon, please. All right. I would thank you for coming to my YouTube channel, but I know how brilliant it is, and I know you love it here. So subscribe and watch. We're going to start really ramping things up and putting some funny stuff, some interesting stuff out there, some collaborations. Either way, my YouTube channel is officially the place to be. So stick around.